Curtis Yarvin has become well known for a concept called the Cathedral, a phrase he coined to describe the decentralized consensus-making apparatus that tends to inform the decisions made by Western governments. In his latest massive essay, Yarvin has expanded that concept, explaining the many different parts that make up what he calls the system. Yarvin's ability to analyze and explain the nature of power has always been the most interesting parts of his writing. So we'll be diving into his explanation of the system today to better understand how power flows and is used inside the United States and the many other Western countries that it influences. Yarvin begins by explaining that Americans are very used to the idea of a written down physical constitution. They've been trained to treat this constitution as some kind of religious revealed truth handed down from on high. It's inscribed in stone and should almost never be changed. Americans are taught that the Constitution is a constant, even though the world may shift around it. As long as the country continues to adhere to these founding words, things will be okay. But of course, this is not how governance actually works. As the country grows and changes, and as their leaders push the country in different directions, the way the country is governed and the way that it's written down in the Constitution that it's supposed to be governed start to change over time. We like to think that these changes are updates made to the Constitution through amendments, but the majority of changes in the way that the country runs are not formalized, and the gap between the way the country is supposed to be run and the way the country is actually run gets wider and wider. And so we end up in a scenario where there's basically a founding myth about the way that the organs of power inside the United States are supposed to function, and then there's an actual way that the organs of power function. It doesn't mean that there are two sets of organs. There are only one set of organs, but there are two explanations, one which is real and one which is mythological. Yarvin calls the story about how power originally was supposed to function inside the United States the Republic, and calls the explanation of how power actually functions inside the country the system. Under the Republic, the United States is basically an elected monarchy. But over time, as the way power actually functions inside the United States has drifted away from that story of the Republic, the United States has instead adopted the structure of an oligarchy. Now, there are many different types of oligarchy, of course. You can have a military oligarchy, you can have a mercantile oligarchy, but Yarvin identifies our oligarchy as a clerical oligarchy. Now, you could call a clerical oligarchy a theocracy, but Yarvin warns that this can be a trap because our Western concept of a theocracy always involves a metaphysical god and a holy book and a central church structure. But our current progressive oligarchy does not contain these things. Instead of making claims that tend to be mystical and supernatural, our clerics tend to make claims that are physical and philosophical. Either way, the result is the same: to make it look like an abstraction is ruling, whether that abstraction be the gods, or justice, or freedom, or liberty, or equality. It doesn't really matter. One of the core strengths of the clerical oligarchy is the ability to make it look like no one actually rules. What rules is the abstraction, and so one person can never truly be held to account. The abstraction is always good. The abstraction is always something to work towards. If there's ever a failure in the system, it's never the abstraction's fault. It's just a failure to realize the beauty of the abstraction. And because the source of their theoretical power is really beyond assault, that means that the clerical oligarchy is always in a very stable position of power. From here, Moldbug begins to lay out the skeleton of the system and explains how the apparatus of the clerical oligarchy differs from the way we've been taught that power in the country works since we were young. We will begin from the bottom with the least powerful of the 5 organs of the system, called the castle. The castle contains the armed might of the United States. This, of course, includes the military and often many law enforcement organizations. While military might traditionally be a place where power can be contested, inside the system, the castle is actually the most well-controlled of all of the organs of power. The divine right of civilian power to rule over the military is ingrained in all Americans from a very young age. And at this point, almost no military commander even thinks about blinking without looking up to their civilian leadership for guidance. An incredibly short leash is kept on the military, and no power is allowed to leak out of this organ of the system. This is, of course, meant to make sure that there will never be a military coup, especially due to the fact that people in the cathedral would be so unable to actually contest along these lines. It is necessary for the power of the military to be subjugated at every turn, and so it is. As we move up, we see the next organ of power inside the system, which is called the factory. The factory contains all the forces of capitalism. It is all the power of industry and corporations. While what seems like large amounts of power may be accumulated inside different corporations in the factory, those corporations are always in a state of war with each other and are required to follow the rules of engagement in that war set out by higher powers inside the system. While we will at times see power leak out of the factory and influence other parts of the system, that power is almost always being used to simply increase profits and feed back into power at the level of the factory. Liberals will often look at the power leaking out of the factory, seeing it influence politicians and societal decisions, and identify that corruption as the actual core problem with society, but this is a mistake. Whatever the terrible decisions of corporate titans, in the end, those values that are informing those decisions are not coming from the factory level. They are coming up higher inside the system, and we'll talk about the levels they come from in a moment. Our next organ of power inside the system is called the Bureau. The Bureau can often seem incredibly powerful because, of course, the other organs of power below it are required to obey its dictates. The Bureau, as its name implies, is the ever-present bureaucracy, constantly keeping an eye on everything inside our civilization. The Bureau's job is to make sure that the rules are always being followed. It sets the rules, it executes the rules, it makes sure that the mechanisms required to make the rules function and to monitor the following of the rules are in place. These are the people who are in charge of making sure that every crushing little specific regulation is followed to the letter all over the country. Your average talk radio conservative thinks that this is where power is actually the problem. They think that the Bureau is actually the source of the rot inside the country, but this too is also a mistake. While the Bureau does have significant power and it does dictate to so many people what they will do with their lives, it does not originate these ideas. The rules that it creates are always following a structure laid out by an organ of power that is one step higher in the system. That organ of power that sits at the top of the structure is, of course, the one that we are already more familiar with from Yarvin's previous work, that is the Cathedral. But Yarvin doesn't just place the Cathedral at the head of the system, he also breaks down further the different divisions inside this decentralized clerical oligarchy, which actually holds the power inside the United States. At the beginning of the Cathedral, we see the brain. The brain is the place where truth is actually created, where it's actually produced. The brain is made up of the college professors, the elite journalists, and the serious artists who put out the cultural ideas that the rest of the system and all of our country eventually adopts. The voice produces true stories, which are the way that different individuals and different organizations inside the system absorb these truths that are handed down from the brain. The conversation is where the elites have their discussions. Yarvin points out a truth that we have discussed many times on this channel, which is that the elites are those that truly set the culture of any given society. We can see from the diagram that in each step, prestige is flowing from one section of the cathedral to another, granting it legitimacy and power. And by adopting the ideas and the stories of the brain and the voice, the conversation and the elites contained inside it are making those ideas trendy and fashionable and palatable to the masses further down the road. The foundation's function inside the cathedral is to lend the power of funding. It's the economic power that pushes these ideas out into the different organs of the system and into the minds and hearts of those that live under the regime. And then, of course, the school is the educational system which takes these ideas that have been created by the brain and have been popularized and made fashionable by the conversation and makes sure that the average citizen is indoctrinated in them for at least a good 10 to 15 years before being released into society. The dream is a complicated and less fleshed out concept that I could probably spend a whole video on, and I may end up doing that sometime in the near future. Now we'll go ahead and look at that fifth and final organ of power for the system called the show. You'll notice that the show is separate from the rest of the organization because it works differently. The show is that mythological story about how the old republic used to run before our clerical oligarchy took over with the system. While the system holds all of the current power, maintaining the show, maintaining the story of how power is in theory supposed to work is essential to its continued success because, of course, our clerical oligarchy never wants you to actually be able to locate its power. One of the keys to its stability is its continued ability to never be held accountable. And the show's primary function is to continue to draw heat away from that clerical oligarchy and towards the system that we all believed for so long was actually the way power works inside the United States. By continuing to indoctrinate the population into believing that our system currently functions in the same way the Republic was supposed to function at the founding of the country, it is able to draw populist energy away from the actual rulers of the country, the clerical oligarchy inside the system. All of our politicians are functionally part of the show. The point of the politicians is to serve as a scapegoat for any failures created by the system itself. Because the elected politicians have almost no power to actually influence long-term the decisions of the system, they serve as the perfect decoys. These people are fully invested in this narrative, to be sure. Much like the gladiators of old, the swords are sharp and the stakes can be incredibly high, but of course this just lends credibility and believability to the show. In the end, every politician, everyone participating in the show is 100% expendable. Those people are never actually essential to the running of the system. They never actually sit at the head of the clerical oligarchy. At any time, members of the show can be sacrificed, all blame can be placed on them, and they of course are keeping the oligarchy from ever actually being held accountable for any of its decisions, any of the directions it is taking the United States or the Western world at large at this point. The show itself wields no real power, but the show is key to making sure that those who are in power can stay in power. It is a key feature granting stability to the system. Armed with a better understanding of how the show works and how the system in general functions, hopefully we are able to better understand our place inside it and what steps we need to take next when confronting the societal problems produced by a corrupt and failing cathedral. Thanks for watching, guys. As always, if you enjoyed the video, please go ahead and click like. If you're here and you haven't subscribed yet, you can go ahead and do that now. If you want to follow me on Twitter or join Kiwich in supporting my work through Subscribestar, the links to do that are in the description down below. Thank you for watching, guys. I really appreciate it. I'll talk to you next time.